We are absolutely delighted to have Linda Colley with us for this academic year. Many or most of you, I think, are familiar with her works and have come to know her also as a person. I will say one or two words about the speaker tonight, and then we will listen to a lecture, and there will, as always, be the opportunity to pose questions and engage in a discussion, which I'm sure will be lively afterwards. Linda Colley is the Shelby M.C. Davis 1958 Professor of History at Princeton University. And the theme she will broach this evening forms a crucial part of the project that she's embarked upon, and that forms the major share of her work here at the Collegium during this academic year. I will say a few words more about that project later on. Linda Colley was got her Ph.D. degree at Cambridge University, and she also was teaching there after her degree. In the early 1980s, she moved on to Yale University in the United States, where she became a university professor. And from 1997 to 2001, to 2003 actually, she was a research professor at the LSE, the London School of Economics and Political Science. The position at Princeton, which she now holds, she has been holding since 2003. She is a member of several learned societies and academies, including being a fellow of the British Academy, the Royal Society of Literature, and the Academia Europaea. And she has been made a commander of the Order of the British Empire. And she holds several honorary degrees and has been playing a very prominent role internationally. I will say one or two words about her research. And as you know, her first book dealt with the development of the Tory Party in the 18th century. She went on from that work to write a book about Lewis Namier, of course, who was a leading British historian during the second part of the first half of the 20th century. Most of his career, he was educated at Oxford, and as so many other Oxford graduates in history from Balliol, he was part of the British delegation at the Versailles Peace Conference after the First World War. But he spent most of his academic career at Manchester. And this is a penetrating and critical analysis that sheds new light on a leading British historian and the role of historiography in Britain. The following book about Britons takes up a theme that, of course, social scientists have dwelt on for a long time, namely that of the formation of identities and the constructive nature of such identities. But in Linda Colley's case, this is really a very deep study of the way in which notions of Britishness emerged in the course of the 18th century, when Scots, Welsh, and English persons are becoming aware or articulating a sense of commonness. Her subsequent work on captives is really a study of Britain and empire on a world scale during a large sweep of time from the early 17th century until the late 19th century. And that work entails moving beyond the British Isles and looking at really global history, but doing so in a highly original way, namely by taking up individuals, composing a set of micro-narratives of people positioned in various parts of the British Empire, telling the experiences of these individuals as captured at the outpost at the peripheries of the empire, whether by the Barbary Corsairs or the native North Americans or by rival powers in British India. Partly as a consequence of this work, she came upon the case of one woman, Elizabeth Marsh, and her next book, The Ordeal of Elizabeth Marsh, is a narrative that covers the West Indies, Europe, Africa, and India through the life of one woman. So this is an extraordinary genre of micro-history or global history linked to each other very closely. So a number of the themes we discussed here last night reappear in the guise in which an historian, a true historian, would treat them, namely by a carefully researched story telling about the experiences of individual persons clearly identifiable and searchable by archives, and relating that to global developments. So that's quite a remarkable and absolutely pioneering work. I mentioned works that deal with this effort to link themes that have been touched upon in historical research previously, in social science research, but also themes that are of high relevance to the public sphere at large. And this is an important part of Linda Colley's scholarly career, that she's also very much a public intellectual. Her work, or rather set of lectures published under the title Acts of Union and Disunion, was delivered for the BBC, and that was prior to the Scottish referendum on independence, and also related to the subsequent Brexit referendum. And I think this captures something essential in Linda's career, namely that she writes for major fora of public discourse, such as the London Review of Books. You just gave a lecture at the invitation of the London Review of Books in the British Museum last week, and the Newark Review of Books, Financial Times, and, as I said, for the BBC. But this is not sort of popularizing in a vulgar sense. It is really taking the call of an historian very seriously and bringing it into dialogue in the public sphere. The work that Linda is working on during her year here has the tentative, perhaps no longer tentative title, The Sword, the Pen and the Globe. And it will deal with shifts in the last, towards the end of the second millennium AD, in global power, naval power, but also the way in which power is translated into written texts by way of constitutions and their effects upon state formation, state reform, and state change. So this will be a truly global history that will also shed light on key themes across the social and human sciences at large. And we are very fortunate in having you here for this year, and it's been a true delight in every conceivable way. And we look forward to hearing your lecture this evening. Thank you so very much. I think we should welcome Linda with a warm applause.
Thank you very much, Bjorn. I want to begin by saying what an honor and a wonderful privilege and pleasure it has been to be granted time in this magical space, which is so fantastic, and to have the company of so many wonderful and friendly scholars. It has been a remarkable experience, and I don't want it to end. Bjorn said something about the book that I'm working on. The title is, of course, changing all the time. I'm not looking at constitutions in particular national locations. I'm looking at diffusion, and I'm not looking at them primarily in legal or even governmental terms. This is global history and this is global history and in some ways cultural history as well. So let me begin with a particular example and then widen out. Reaching a quorum on May the 25th, 1787, they embraced seclusion. Armed guards encircled their place of meeting, the red brick State House in Philadelphia. In case any intruders still slipped through, the windows were kept shut and covered over on the inside with heavy drapes. As for the green-painted meeting room itself, no journalists or spectators were allowed in to report and bear witness. The delegates themselves agreed not to pass on information to outsiders. Nothing said or done in the green room was to be printed or otherwise published without leave. Instead, 7 hours a day, 6 days a week, for close to 4 months, they crowded into the airless green room to listen and debate. Only on September the 8th were they ready to forward their text to a committee of style. 9 days later, the just over 4,500-word draft of a constitution for the United States was formally set down on 4 sheets of parchment. But then another thing happened. That same day, September the 17th, a copy of the Constitution was dispatched to the printers. By late October, it had appeared in 75 US newspapers, as well as in multiple pamphlets and broadsides, and was starting to filter into print on the other side of the Atlantic. The making of this constitution had been secretive to a fault. So why this extensive resort thereafter to print? Radical idealism was certainly part of the answer. By the last third of the 18th century, proponents of advanced political change were more willing to argue that texts to do with government should be made widely available in print, and that even the undereducated were competent to understand them. These assumptions powered Sweden's Freedom of the Press Act in 1766, for example, the world's first Freedom of Information Act, as it were. It was an easy step from accepting that government texts should be more freely available to urging that members of the public should be educated so that they could better understand political systems. This belief lay behind the formation, for instance, of the Society for Constitutional Information in London in 1780, which aimed to distribute free political tracts universally throughout the realm and even into the humble dwelling of the cottager. Politics must be accessible to every eye, wrote one of this society's founders, made visible and tangible by having been committed to print. It was partly ideals of this sort that lay behind a clause in the draft US Constitution requiring that it be ratified by at least 9 of the 13 American states, a provision that placed a premium on wide publicity. But there were also other considerations at work. A constitution is not just a text to do with government and law. It can function as a kind of story. And it is not accidental, I think, that the use and popularity of this sort of text accelerated at about the same time as the novel in literature. Widely distributed, a constitution could disseminate attractive ideas about a particular nation or empire, and also encompass and put forward a distinctive brand. This sort of publicity was especially valuable as far as the American Constitution was concerned, because as a very recently invented polity, the United States in reality was not very united at all. There were deep divisions between its northern states and the more slave-owning South, and between its well-established eastern regions and settler communities in the Trans-Appalachian West. America's territorial boundaries remained contested, and it faced the real possibility of further violence, whether on the part of rebel states or from the European empires. It is suggestive that 9 of the first 10 Federalist papers, originally published by Alexander Hamilton and others in the New York press in the autumn of 1787 to argue for the Constitution's ratification, 9 out of 10 of them were devoted to dangers from dissensions between the states and dangers from foreign force and influence. In these circumstances, the non-stop reprinting of the draft Constitution served a vital persuasive function. Even so, final ratification in 1788 proved a very close-run thing. It could very easily not have happened. Print did more than help to bring ratification about, however. It also spread information about the United States and its constitution abroad. Already during the War of Independence, Benjamin Franklin, himself a one-time printer, had made adroit use of revolutionary portfolios, bound collections of the American Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the state constitutions, and other signal political texts. These were reprinted in bulk, packaged up, and systematically distributed during the Revolutionary War to centers of power overseas as a way of rallying support for the revolution and making clear America's determination to keep going. From 1787, there was a further calculated resort to print so as to persuade foreign capitals of the stability and creditworthiness of the United States. They had to get trade, they had to get loans, so they're appealing overseas. Whenever American diplomats left on overseas postings, they presented copies of the new Constitution to the local ruler and major political and economic players. American consuls, merchants, and other overseas agents did the same, while letters sent abroad by American politicians were also often accompanied by a copy of the new Constitution. Thus, when George Washington wrote in 1789 to inform Sidi Muhammad, the formidable Sultan of Morocco, of the document's successful ratification, he was careful to add, "of which I have the honor of herewith enclosing a copy." In implementing this overseas campaign, Americans were ironically able to exploit the long-standing connections between their own printing houses and counterparts in Britain, the former imperial enemy. Just 5 weeks after its initial appearance in Philadelphia in September 1787, the American Constitution was already circulating in London newspapers. By November, a complete bound version was on sale in Britain, priced at just a shilling. And this was only the start. London was both a prime centre of print and the world's busiest port. It was also the node city of a still violently expanding overseas empire. Consequently, anything significant published in London on American political initiatives and texts was likely also to be shipped onwards to multiple locations across the globe. And you have this very paradoxical situation which operates throughout, that London, capital of a place which infamously has no written Constitution is one of the great conduits for sending copies of other people's constitutions around the globe, and this goes on and on. The success of this very self-conscious print campaign to embed the new American Constitution at home and communicate it widely overseas ensured that strategies of this sort were widely copied by other polities. This is one reason, indeed, why writers of constitutions frequently incorporated provisions to do with print in these texts. An incomplete collection of constitutional texts drafted in the Americas, Europe, West Africa, and the Pacific world between 1776 and 1850 reveals, for instance, at least 560 provisions scattered throughout these texts that touch in some way on the freedom and availability of the printing press and its works. This exceeds the number of references in these texts to almost every other political right, be it freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, or whatever. This desire to make some provision for print is evident even in constitutions that emerged from parts of the world where literacy levels were poor, or from regimes that were fundamentally authoritarian. For the business of making, embedding, and publicizing written constitutions, which increasingly became desirable icons of modernity, print was simply too useful to be neglected. Print appealed in multiple sites for some of the same reasons that made its use belatedly irresistible to the delegates at Philadelphia in 1787. It was repeatedly rushed into service so that constitutions might impart stories of identity and allegiance, and not just rules of government to domestic populations, something that appeared particularly vital in newly invented and constructed states. Once the draft is printed, stipulate the authors of a constitution in Chile in 1818, it will be published by order in all of the cities, villages, and towns of the state. Let it be printed, published, and circulated, instruct the makers of Bolivia's first adopted constitution in 1826. Print was also used, as in the American case, with a view to legitimizing new-made political regimes in the eyes of foreign observers. Take the case of Venezuela. In 1811, this became the first part of South America, or perhaps one of the first parts, to declare independence from Spain. And its new-made Congress drafted a federal constitution. Together with other documents, a copy of this Venezuelan constitution was promptly shipped to London. Once there, bound editions of these founding texts were published, with Spanish and English versions printed on alternate pages. Without their written and now printed constitution, proclaimed the introduction to this booklet, Venezuela's people could not have solemnly declared their intention to the world. It would have been more accurate to say that without access to print and to a transoceanic transmitter of print, like the Port of London, Venezuelan activists would have found it much harder to inform other governments of their new-made existence or to lay claim to autonomy and to territorial boundaries, which were both still very much in contention. But it is Haiti, the one-time French plantation colony, Saint-Domingue, that offers perhaps the most vivid example of how independence struggles and the demands of inventing a new political system could drive the need for print. The man now widely regarded as the founding father of an independent Haiti, the one-time plantation slave turned fierce General Jacques Dessalines, seems to have been largely illiterate. He also could not speak any European language, only Haitian Creole. He was presumably, therefore, unable to read the brief constitution in simple French, published under his name and by his instructions in 1805. This declared that all Haitians were free, equal, and irrespective of ethnicity, black. It also proclaimed Dessalines himself emperor for life. Since the vast majority of Haiti's inhabitants at this time were also illiterate, they too were in no position to read this new constitution or the 6 others that were published here between 1801 and 1816. Communicating with and training up an engaged mass citizenry was manifestly then not the prime reason why the makers of these Haitian constitutions resorted to print. Rather, what drove Dessalines in this respect, and those who came after him, was something else. These men needed print to signal and hopefully consolidate their own leading positions, and to invent and foster, if they could, a frail national unity. Still more crucially, they wanted to be able to transmit these printed constitutions abroad so as to have a chance of winning recognition for Haiti's newly autonomous political identity and secure access to foreign commerce, allies, and loans, especially given what long seemed a possibility of a French re-invasion or an invasion by another imperial power. Especially during the so-called Age of Revolutions, which can more appropriately be described as an age of incessant transcontinental warfare. These connections between high levels of violence, the writing of new constitutions, and the mass production of print were widely recognized. They hold up a paper constitution as their shield, wrote a commentator in the 1820s, but very often the sword pierces through and drinks their heart's blood. Yet whether they proved successful or no, every constitution that was put into print was likely to be reported in multiple foreign sites as well as in its place of origin, and therefore likely as well to foster increasing awareness of these political devices and of what they were designed to do. So what were the broader ramifications of this? For some answers, let me briefly go back again to America. The United States was not, in fact, the first polity to issue a recognizably modern type of written constitution, nor were the print strategies deployed by its leaders entirely novel in fact. The sheer scale of these strategies did help, however, to make this constitution very widely known. Pache David Armitage, before the First World War especially, the 1787 Constitution was a far better known document across the globe than the American Declaration of Independence. But does this mean that the American Constitution also had a disproportionate political and ideological impact? Was this the constitutional model that came to matter most, something that has often been claimed? There can be no doubt that the American Revolution and what followed attracted massive interest at the time, and that this continued afterwards. It was also the case that the United States, and hence its constitution, was able to appeal to different peoples in different ways at different times. To radical proponents of manhood suffrage, such as British and Irish Chartists in the 1830s and 40s, American constitutionalism could seem to represent an alluring degree of democracy. Given its successful struggle against Britain, America and its constitution also appealed to those peoples having to contend with British expansionism, of which there were a lot. Thus, intellectuals and court officials in Beijing became markedly more interested in George Washington and his military and legislative achievements in the late 1830s, when Britain's East India Company and Royal Navy challenged Chinese sovereignty in regard to the opium trade. Conversely, by the later 19th century, as the United States itself came to practice overseas empire as well as overland imperialism, its constitution was able to attract admirers among, for instance, newly united Germans, who relished the American amalgam of masculine democracy, successful empire, and again, resistance to the British. But while the US Constitution attracted wide attention well into the 20th century, the design for government it set out proved less straightforwardly contagious. There are many reasons for this, but one of them, again, was print. Vital for the dissemination and operation of constitutions, print also restricted the degree to which any individual example of this political genre could swamp and dominate the market. As more and more constitutions were written, and as they were promiscuously distributed, translated, and reprinted in the press, interested readers in different parts of the world were supplied not just with the details of the US Constitution, but also with descriptions of other countries' constitutions. Print, in short, could present men and women with multiple choices in this regard. Savvy publishers helped to make this growing awareness of the range and diversity of constitutions even easier. Ever since the 16th century, it had been common for manuals to be published, giving samples of different kinds of letters, as well as guidance for eager but unconfident letter writers. Such manuals often offered examples of letters of business, letters of love, letters of condolence, etc., and tips on how to write them. In much the same fashion, from the 1790s onwards, more and more guides were published, bringing together and discussing the texts of different political constitutions. Such compendia allowed those interested in politics and in constitution writing to study a range of available models from across the world. Thus, in 1923, in the wake of the successful Irish Revolution, the new Dublin government commissioned a compendium of the world's constitutions in advance of issuing its own. This Irish omnibus caught the eye of an Indian nationalist who issued his own version of this text in the 1930s in what was then Madras, so that his fellow nationalist sympathizers could study different forms of government in readiness for the independence that was to come. Because of this wide print circulation, whether in newspapers, official correspondence, pamphlets, or omnibus collections, those wanting to write a new political constitution were increasingly in a position of being able to adopt a policy of pick and mix. They could study an expanding archive of constitutions from different locations and then select ideas, provisions, and even whole paragraphs from favored examples, combining these mixed borrowings with their own particular traditions, political ideas, and requirements. Thus, a Victorian investigator who painstakingly analysed the Norwegian Constitution of 1814 discovered influences within it and, in some cases, verbatim translations from the French revolutionary constitutions of 1791, 1793, and 1795, the American Federal Constitution and several state constitutions, the Polish Constitution of 1791, the Dutch Constitution of 1798, the Swedish of 1809, and the Spanish of 1812. Norwegian legislators in 1814 borrowed extensively, in other words. But like others of their sort, they did not borrow exclusively from the Constitution of the United States or from any other single source. Moreover, and this needs separate discussion and I can go into it later, these men would have worked in the main from translations, texts that were already, therefore, at some remove from the originals. Studying different published constitutions, whether in the original language or in translation, was not confined to official players. Individual reformers and intellectuals also took advantage of the growing abundance of constitutional print to hone their thinking about political and legal change and possibilities. Consider the upsurge in interest in constitutional matters that occurred in sections of the Bengal newspaper press in the 1820s. By this stage, Calcutta was one of the world's great centres of print, catering partly to the East India Company, but also to individual, sometimes radical actors. Two of the best known of these in the 1810s and early 20s were an Englishman, James Silk Buckingham, and Mohan Roy, a Bengali Brahmin. Both were remarkable men, active reformers, fascinated by constitutions, avid writers, and consciously hybrid beings. Buckingham was the undereducated son of a Cornish farmer who travelled widely, as he boasted, in Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. Mohan Roy was a more scholarly and far more patrician figure, but no less divided. He served the East India Company at intervals while also criticising aspects of its rule and British racial arrogance, and he was fluent in Persian, Sanskrit, Hindi, and Arabic, as well as English, also attempting French. The newspaper linking these two men, the Calcutta Journal, was also a hybrid creation. It regularly reprinted material from London papers which were shipped into Calcutta in bulk and which Mohan in particular devoured. But the paper also benefited from Calcutta's own position as a node city and major port with its own regional networks of information. Now, both Mohan and Buckingham admired the political achievements of the United States. But American constitutions receive limited attention in the Calcutta Journal. Instead, the paper's focus was much more on the Spanish and Portuguese worlds and on the one-time South American colonies that were now disrupting them. The journal regularly printed extracts from new South American constitutions, publishing, for instance, a specially commissioned translation of a constitution for an independent Peru, as well as articles on the Gran Colombia founding constitution drawn from the Caracas press. The crucial reason for the Calcutta Journal's focus on constitutionalism in the Spanish and Portuguese worlds is suggested, I think, by its highlighted reprinting of a clause from Mexico's 1821 Declaration of Independence. All the inhabitants of New Spain, without any distinction of Europeans, Africans, or Indians, are citizens of this monarchy and eligible to every office according to their merit and virtue. Both Buckingham and Mohan wanted improved liberties and rights for India's indigenous populations. And in this context, the constitutionalism practiced by the United States was of limited attractiveness and appropriateness as a model. To be sure, the Federal Constitution of 1787 contained no explicit reference to race, but it included concessions to Southern slaveholders. Moreover, by the 1820s, a rising number of state constitutions in the USA were explicitly excluding from political rights or disadvantaging those who were not white. By contrast, Portuguese and Spanish liberals in Europe and many independence activists in South America worked in the tradition of the Cadiz Constitution of 1812, which had explicitly offered measures of political emancipation across racial divides. It seems likely, therefore, that in deciding what to include in the Calcutta Journal, both Mohan and Buckingham carried out their own work of pick and mix. Normally enthusiastic about the United States, they pushed its constitutional texts aside, giving priority instead to texts from South America and the Iberian Peninsula, which were more congenial and useful for the new, more broadly encompassing Indian politics that they wanted and championed. These interventions in the Calcutta Journal helped to explain why, by the 1820s, some commentators were able already to envisage a world where reforming written constitutions would be ubiquitous. Revolutions hitherto have been solitary, wrote one radical journalist. But now one feeling seems to pervade all nations. We shall see the Asiatic states demanding the representative system in a few years, aye, and the African too. Yet like other information systems, like the so-called World Wide Web now, print was not, of course, an equal access or equal opportunity facility. Some regions and peoples were much better positioned than others to access and deploy it. The rootedness of the new political constitutions in writing and print obviously disadvantaged, for instance, those people who lacked a written language. Written constitutionalism thus formed part of the growing marginalization in the 19th century of many tribal peoples. Unless careful and regular provision was made for translations and for reading texts out aloud, this form of political technology could also disadvantage minority language groups and those who were unable to read. The growing vogue for written and printed constitutions also initially posed challenges for large stretches of the Ottoman Empire and parts of North Africa and the Middle East, where illustrious traditions existed of bureaucratic, religious, and scholarly script, but where printing presses emerged only slowly. Moreover, while print mattered, the interests and identity of those in possession of power locally tended to matter much more. This was not just the case as regards Euro-America. There were large stretches of the non-Western world, Japan, for instance, and China, where print had long been widely available. Yet no written and printed constitution would be adopted in Japan until the 1880s, or in China before the early 20th century. Not because of technological or literacy obstacles primarily, but rather because of the protracted resistance to political change of the Japanese and Chinese ruling orders. But perhaps the most poignant example, both of the links between written constitutions and print, and of the degree to which access to print could be made subordinate to power, is a set of events again in the United States. By the late 1820s, the 13 American states, which the men of Philadelphia had taken for granted in 1787, had risen to 24, while the registered US population had tripled. Yet the near 13 million people head-counted in the 1830 United States Census were not the whole story. Deliberately left out were Native Americans, not liable for tax, but not in the main slaves either. These people were not counted among the US citizenry. So what were they? In 1827, some activists among the 15,000 or so Cherokee Indians, based largely in the emerging state of Georgia, decided that what they could be was an independent nation, and consequently that they needed a written constitution. By this stage, rising number of Cherokee were literate. Moreover, they had learned to print. One of their number, Sequoyah, had invented a version of the Cherokee language that could be written down, and suitable fonts were soon devised for a printing press. As a result, they were able to found a newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, the first ever published by Native Americans. Some of their leaders also held a convention in 1827 and wrote and printed a constitution for the future government of the Cherokee Nation. Like other constitution writers, these men cut and pasted, but they also set down distinct territorial boundaries, insisting that these would hereafter remain unalterably the same. They also set down laws and opened the vote to all free adult male Cherokees. Most of all, they asserted in this constitution their status as a free and distinct nation governing itself. None of this worked. Neither the US government at Washington nor the Georgia legislature accepted the legality of this constitution or the validity of Cherokee national aspirations. In the 1830s, most of these Indians were forcibly driven out of Georgia and relocated further west, some 4,000 of them dying in transit. At one level, this sad episode underlines again how closely print was intertwined with constitution making. At another level, this episode confirms how the political opportunities made available by print could be suppressed or sidelined by those with power. But at yet another level, I think, this Cherokee initiative hints at something else. In his Democracy in America, first published in 1835, Alexis de Tocqueville generally writes with sensitivity about the plight of American Indians. But as regard the Cherokee, he does not write with sensitivity. They had a newspaper before all of them had clothes, he jibes, adding that he had taken 1 or 2 copies of this peculiar publication back home with him to France. It is as if Tocqueville could sympathize with noble savages in retreat, but not with Native Americans who were experimenting with modern technology and politics. That the Cherokee nonetheless did so underlines finally the point that written and printed constitutions could sometimes prove volatile and unstable instruments. Thank you.